Good morning. F&L News Hour moves to Scotland, to Ayrshire, to Dumfries House. Dumfries House is an 18th century Palladian residence with associated grounds covering 2,000 acres. Now our guest today is Sir Malcolm Rifkind, the Right Honourable Sir Malcolm Rifkind. He's also a Queen's Counsel. He has been Secretary of State for Scotland, Secretary of State for Transport, Defence Secretary and Foreign Secretary. And subsequently, following 18 years of ministerial office, he became Chairman of the Intelligence Security Committee in the House of Commons. So, Sir Malcolm, welcome
Thank you very much.
To Dumfries House and to the F&L News Hour. I think last night was quite interesting. I was watching News 24 in France, the French news channel, my favourite one, and the cyber problems which hit this weekend and hit the UK NHS now impact on 75,000 organisations and 100 countries. Given your background in intelligence and security, where are we at with this?
Okay, it is a problem. It's not just a British problem, it's a global issue arising out of the extraordinary advances in technology. A lot of the publicity about cyber crime or cyber attacks has been about state-to-state attacks, whether the Russians have been interfering with American elections, whether the Chinese have been trying to find out what's happening in various countries. And that does exist, and it's a huge problem. But there's two other dimensions to it as well. There are also what are often called the cyber criminals, people whose objective is not political, but is making money, is carrying out criminal acts and using the methods of cyber attack in order to advance that interest. And sometimes they work for some of the rogue governments as well, because they are used for that purpose. And the third dimension is individual hackers, individuals in their own house with sort of great enthusiasm of demonstrating how powerful they are and interfering with other people's business in a way that is unacceptable. So it's a big, big challenge to every government around the world. And some governments have come to that judgment very quickly, or have already done a lot of work on trying to prevent cyber attacks, or also on the question of resilience, how you cope in terms of your infrastructure if it has been subject to attack, how quickly you can get it back to normal. These are the issues that all countries are having to address.
But when you were involved with the Security Committee, Huawei and BT, you were very concerned about a Chinese state company being involved with BT. I mean, is this a problem?
That was a particular issue because we have no particular problem, either as an Intelligence Security Committee or the public as a whole, with Chinese investment or investment by other countries in the United Kingdom. We're an open economy, we welcome investment. That is no problem. The particular controversy with regard to British telecommunications is that they were modernizing their infrastructure and proposing to use Huawei, and indeed were using Huawei, as part of that modernization program. The concern was that as all companies, all industries in China ultimately are answerable to the Chinese Communist Party, the government of China, and as the government of China allows cyber attacks and other interference as a matter of political policy, how wise was it to have such a company involved in our infrastructure? The United States and Australia had banned Huawei, said they will not prepare to deal with them. When we looked into this, a decision had been taken some years earlier to allow British Telecom to work with Huawei. And what we have got in the United Kingdom now is a unique situation. Huawei was so anxious to demonstrate how respectable and reasonable and law-abiding they would be, that what has been established is a cell of people who are paid, their salaries are paid by the Chinese, but they're actually, the appointments are made by the United Kingdom, and these are people who constantly monitor the way in which the system, the telecommunications system is working, so that if there was any interference of a improper kind, we would immediately know about it, and that would be such bad news for Huawei that it would, in practice, damage their international credibility to a high degree.
Well, before we go on to the next topic, which will certainly be Scotland, given that was your first cabinet post, I introduced you as the Right Honourable. Now, most of my continental colleagues are not aware of the role of the Privy Council and what it does. What does it do?
Well, you may be called Right Honourable. It doesn't necessarily mean you're right or even honourable. It is purely an honorific designation. Basically, its historic origins, the Privy Council were what we now would call the Cabinet. They were the senior advisors to the Queen or King and were the people appointed to that. In more recent times, there remains a Privy Council. It has no real political power, but it has a role in some of what we call delegated legislation, the way in which a lot of detailed legislation is approved. And in addition to that, you're appointed to the Privy Council if either you're a member of the Cabinet or you are seen to be either as a senior judge or a senior parliamentarian, someone of that sort of background who might be able to make a useful contribution.
But you're still a member of the Privy Council?
Once you're appointed, unless you do something very, very naughty,
you stay.
You remain one person.
And apparently you stand up in all the Privy Council meetings, is that
No.
not the case?
Well, this is a misunderstanding. When you have heard that there are about 300 Privy Councillors, right. And when you have heard there has been a meeting of the Privy Council, that actually only means 5 or 6 current ministers who are Privy Councillors who go to the palace in order to complete certain legislative proposals. Right. The rest of us are not involved in that. The only time I will be active as a Privy Councillor is when, sadly, one day when the Queen dies, the new king will have to be proclaimed as king, and that is done at a meeting of the full Privy Council. It's the only time Privy Council ever actually meets in the full body. Good.
Let's, Sir Malcolm, come on to the Scottish question. Very interesting that as Scottish Secretary, you were Scotland's man in the Cabinet,
as well
or
as
alternatively, the Cabinet's man in Scotland.
Yes.
Well, which side predominated?
Well, that was some of the difficulty I had with my relations with Margaret Thatcher, as the Prime Minister at the time. She assumed I was just the Cabinet's man in Scotland, and I said, yes, that's true, Prime Minister, but I'm also Scotland's man in the Cabinet, by which I meant that if there were demands from Scotland for certain changes, for certain policies or proposals, I didn't automatically agree with that, but if I did agree with it, I was their champion. This is in the days before a Scottish Parliament existed, or a Scottish devolved government, so the Secretary of State had that particular role.
Now, I suppose one of the key questions my continental colleagues asked me, and last week I was in Munich for the week, and I had the question 20 times, what's Scotland going to do in the context of the European Union? I mean, could Scotland effectively go it alone, either in the context of independence or in the context of the European Union?
Well, in theory, all these options are possible, but if you ask me, is that likely? I think it's incredibly improbable and unlikely. Because apart from anything else, you know, the argument that the Scottish nationalists used is if Britain is going to leave the European Union, then in order for Scotland to have access to the internal market, now is the time for it to become an independent state, a member of the EU in its own right, and thereby would have access to the European internal market. But of course, the consequence would also be that it would cease to have access to the United Kingdom internal market, namely England and Wales. And Scotland exports 2 to 3 times as much of its exports, of its industry and services to England and Wales than it does to continental Europe. That's not a great surprise. So we have had a single market within Britain since the Act of Union in 1707. It would be pretty dumb to actually destroy that for a market that is less important as far as Scotland's economy is concerned.
But I mean, legally, could they have a separate negotiation with the EU?
No, not as part of the United Kingdom. No, not as long as they're part of the United Kingdom. You cannot have any part of a member state of the EU having a different relationship with the European Union than the country of which it is part. And the EU itself has made that clear. I mean, this was, I don't think the Scottish nationalists ever believed that was possible. It was a presentational argument to make them seem more reasonable and willing to compromise than was in fact the case. It was never on the cards.
Well, let's go on to transport. I think you were surprised to become Transport Secretary from what I gather. But I understand within 3 days you were the British minister in the Channel Tunnel welcoming the French, or the French were welcoming you. Is that right?
This is the way I choose to present it. That
Did the French present it a different way?
Well, I don't know. But no. For several hundreds of years, people had talked about a Channel Tunnel. And no sooner did I become Transport Secretary, 3 days later, I was under the English Channel meeting my French counterpart, because the people digging from either side, at that stage, just digging the hole that the Eurostar would eventually be used to fill, that's when we had the breakthrough. And I wasn't the first person to shake hands for 10,000 years. That honour was given to a workman on either side who'd been doing the actual digging. So a British guy and a French guy did that. And then the 2 ministers, myself and my French counterpart, did that. But even then, vive la différence between Britain and France, because, for example, The French, we had a celebration. The French were drinking champagne, and I think we had sparkling water. There were signs on the British side, strictly no smoking, because we were underground. The French were smoking their 10 Bleus and their Gaulois. So, vive la différence.
Well, but do you think actually the tunnel, which is the direct link, of course, between the continent and the UK, has changed anything in the political climate? The fact we've got a physical link?
Yeah, curiously enough, not in the political climate. We're still an island, whether it was a tunnel or a bridge, you don't cease to be an individual country with a distinct culture because of that island status. And so I don't think it's had a political impact. I think it's had a cultural impact. And it obviously, I mean, I'm just a few days from now, I shall be going by Eurostar to Brussels. And it's the only way I would travel nowadays to Paris or Brussels. I would never dream of going by plane. It's much more comfortable and sensible. So it's a huge achievement. I think it's particularly important for freight. It seemed to me that I've always believed that if you're able to maximize the freight opportunities, then we can now contemplate a situation of getting massive amounts of freight, either from British factories right through to markets in Italy or Spain or France or Germany, or vice versa, in a way that would not have been possible. And that takes a huge potential burden off our roads. I think, I've always believed this, that there is a massive public interest in getting less freight carried on the roads and more on rail. And that was never really possible in terms of international trade until the Channel Tunnel was built. Now, I know it's still, there are big problems, but most of these problems ought to be soluble, at least over a period of time.
Now, interestingly, I mean, we're coming to a general election in the United Kingdom in June 8. The Labour Party is talking about nationalising the railways. I understand as Transport Secretary, you were very much in favour of the privatisation process. In fact, were the Minister responsible for its process?
Only for the early stage, but I had disagreements, and that might explain why I was only Transport Minister for a relatively short period, because although I did strongly support and do support the privatisation of the railways, I think it's been a huge plus, and we've seen a massive growth in passenger use of the railways in Britain over these years. But I thought then, and I still think, it was unwise to separate the control of the trains using the track from the control of the infrastructure. Railtrack, the creation of Railtrack as a separate body owning and controlling ultimately all the infrastructure. And what persuaded me, I didn't have that view before I came to the Department of Transport. I hadn't really thought about it. But the more I thought about it as Transport Secretary, the more I took the view that, as if I'm not mistaken, something like 40% of costs for an operator relate to the infrastructure. It's not very, it's counterintuitive, it's not very sensible that the operator in effect has little control over 40% of his costs, because that is the infrastructure which is owned and operated by somebody else. So I've never been persuaded that that was a wise way forward.
Well, Britain's model is, of course, quite different. I mean, in Germany, with DB, they are both infrastructure and operator.
Yeah, well, that's the
but that you preferred that.
I've preferred it then, but the Treasury didn't, because they thought that would make competition much less likely if one operator also controlled the infrastructure. My point was that the competition for the vast majority of these lines didn't come from two operators wanting to offer rail services on the same line. The real competition came from road and air, whether people would travel by air or by road as opposed to train. That's where the real, there are one or two exceptions to that, but for the most of the rail infrastructure, there isn't any serious prospect of competitors. You can have people competing for the initial tender, but not simultaneously operating on the lines.
Well, I mean, that's a big debate. We could spend a whole discussion on that. As a matter of interest, one of my colleagues in the Freight Leaders Forum and I sit on the management board of the European Railway Agency in Valenciennes. We are there as so-called freight experts. Do you see, with Brexit, Britain withdrawing from that, given the commitment of the European Agency for Railways is standard signals, standard systems of operation and safety standards throughout Europe? Do you see us coming out of that?
I'm not an expert in this area, but I think this is just one of the issues where there still will have to be cooperation and collaboration and hopefully common standards. the way you regulate that, the way you administer that, may have to change to reflect the fact that we're no longer a member of the European Union. But it will depend ultimately if both the British side and the continental European side both want to maintain easiest rail access, then all the progress that has been made in that sphere over the last few years, both sides will want to perpetuate, even though it may require a different form in order to...
Well, I think one of our concerns is, will the government listen to us who are involved in it? And I think that's the concern, because...
But do you mean listen or do you mean agree?
Well, I think it's our job. I think, as you said, Sir Malcolm, that it's the job of government in intelligence to produce a cogent argument to support their point of view.
Yes.
Our obligation would to provide that cogent argument.
Yes, the obligation you will have is to persuade the government, which you may very well be able to do, that it's not just in your interest, but it's in the wider public interest. That is the crucial question, because very often when you have parts of industry or parts of business talking to government, they use the language of the public interest, but actually it's the interest of their own particular sector that they're preoccupied with. And sometimes that is the same as the public interest, but not always.
I think one of the disappointments for us with the Trans-European networks, 10T, this became a big issue, I think, after you were Transport Secretary. But it's been one of, we think, the best successes in Europe. There's 9 vertical corridors where the majority of people and freight will move over the next 20, 30 years. And the concept is to remove barriers or bottlenecks.
Well, that must be right.
The question is, if a lot of projects have been financed under 10T within the UK, it'll be interesting to see if the UK has to give the money back for the projects that have been undertaken.
Well, I'd be surprised if money has to be given back. If the money's been spent and it's been spent properly, then regardless of who was spending it, then that seems, as long as it was properly done at the time, I don't think there'll be any retrospective change. But I think the more complex question is how you provide for cooperation in the future.
Well, turning to defence, which, I mean, you enjoyed your time, as we can see, at the Ministry of Defence. I think one of the issues is that Britain is spending 2% of its GDP on defence. A lot of our continental friends are not. How do we explain to our continental colleagues Britain's role in the defence of Europe? We have got the Triton submarines. We have got the 3rd biggest defence budget in the world. How do our continental colleagues relate to that? Do they actually, to some degree, rely on the United Kingdom for the defence?
Well, let's be clear, what we're discussing at the moment on defence is not EU business. The European Union does not directly deal with defence policy. It deals with other forms of security, and that's very important. But defence is essentially a NATO responsibility, our membership of NATO, that deals with these issues. And you are correct in saying that the United Kingdom, not just the United Kingdom, but the United Kingdom and a relatively small number of other European countries do comply with the agreement that defence expenditure should be at least 2% of GDP. There's a lot of pressure from the United States at the moment on other countries to come up to that level, and they are beginning to move in that direction. But the level that we spend on our defence in the United Kingdom reflects our own historic responsibilities. And of course, we are not just a European country, we also have strong maritime interests. Traditionally, our Royal Navy has been perhaps the most important of the 3 services in historic terms in the United Kingdom. And it's interesting that at the moment in our defence expenditure, you mentioned the Trident submarines, which are the fundamental part of our nuclear defence structure, but there are also the 2 new aircraft carriers being built, which will be state-of-the-art aircraft carriers and enable the UK to deploy its military capability globally whenever that is thought to be necessary. So I think in terms of Europe's overall defence and security, whether we're in the EU or outside the EU, the United Kingdom is a crucial player. We're in the permanent member of the Security Council. We're along with France, one of the 2 European countries that have nuclear weapons capabilities, and also along with France, we are the 2 countries with the most serious military conventional capability. So I think that is already recognised as likely to be a very important area of future cooperation.
But it's interesting, the Europeans were quite keen to develop a European defence force, whereas
They were quite keen to use that rhetoric.
And do you think it was rhetoric only?
Well, not entirely rhetoric, but I think, France and Germany, who are the two most important countries in this respect, have both made it abundantly clear they are not remotely interested in a European army, and I mean quite literally a single army, because if you have a European army, you must then have a European government to determine whether to use that army. I mean, you can't have that dealt with by 27 countries. So the idea is completely out of the equation. Where the issue has been controversial recently, the serious proposal that had emerged from within the European Union was whether the European Union should facilitate a command and control arrangement to cover operations which were not NATO operations, but where European countries by themselves were wanting to carry out a particular task. Britain and Poland and Baltic states and some others were rather concerned about that, because we thought that that would weaken NATO and the benefits would be outweighed by the disadvantages. Others took a different view. Now that the United Kingdom will be leaving the European Union, it's for the other countries to make up their mind whether they still wish to go in that direction.
But presumably, well, we would hope that NATO will still be the primary
it's crucial.
organisation.
Well, I mean, of course, there was a debate in the immediate aftermath of the end of the Cold War whether we still needed NATO. Thanks to Mr. Putin's policies in Crimea and Ukraine, and destabilizing the Baltic states, or trying to, that is no longer an issue. All NATO countries now agree that not only is NATO needed, but it's needed to a greater degree than has been required at any time since 1989.
Well, what did you do to Mr. Putin? In what way did you upset him such that he's banned you from Russia?
Me personally, you mean?
Yes,
well,
apparently.
I can give you an answer. I'm not the only one. No, this is when, as a consequence of the illegal annexation of Crimea, which was the worst example since 1938 of one European state annexing the territory of another without proper diplomatic and serious negotiations involved, but just by an act of military capability, and also destabilized eastern Ukraine, which continues to be a major flashpoint. There was no question of NATO going to war with Russia, but the decision was taken to impose economic sanctions. And there were a number of us who argued that these sanctions couldn't just be symbolic, they had to be financial and banking sanctions of a kind that were helpful in getting Iran to the nuclear negotiating table, and so forth. So these have been implemented, and the Russians were rather annoyed about that. And about 60 or 70 European senior political figures, including myself,
were banned.
We were never directly informed of that, right. But the Russians let it be known.
You would not be welcome.
Handed somebody in Brussels a list of names, of which I was, well, all I can say is if there had to be such a list, I was very proud to be on it.
Going on to, I suppose, well, we'll just briefly touch in the United States. You talk about the Atlantic as being a bridge rather than a gulf. Do you still think that? And are you confident or not confident about trade deals? Mr. Trump's clearly challenged some of the trade deals that have been put in place.
Well, if you're discreetly asking whether I'm a great admirer of President Trump, the answer is no, I'm not. I think it's a deeply disturbing fact that we have a president of the United States who has the temperament and the volatility and the inexperience that he represents. And any president who spends part of his time tweeting as a way of communicating with the outside world, I think is incredibly dangerous and foolish. So I start as somebody who's deeply nervous about what we are experiencing. But I have to acknowledge, as everyone else does, that he is the elected president of the United States. And therefore, during the time he is president, we have to do our best to work with him. And fortunately, he seems to think the United Kingdom is a country he has more time for than some others, for whatever reason, perhaps because his mother was Scottish, who knows. And therefore, there are many areas of cooperation that continue, and that's very healthy.
Well, I think it's very important. There's so many countries coming to Glasgow this week, very important. And most of them are from the continent. What advice do you give them in terms of how they should look at the United Kingdom, A, in terms of the negotiation, and B, in terms of will we still continue to trade?
Okay.
How will our relationships change? I think that's very fundamental.
Right, let me comment on that if I may. I think the first crucial point is to recognise that what happened in the United Kingdom over Brexit was not similar to what is called Trumpism in the United States. When Trump was negotiating, was campaigning, he was asking for a mandate to do some pretty extreme things across a whole spectrum of areas, quite different to anything the United States had been doing under any president for very many years. And that still remains part of his aspirations, even if he's having difficulty implementing that. In France, you've had the Le Pen dimension of the National Front and so forth. The United Kingdom was quite different. We have had no extreme right-wing party. UKIP was not an extreme right-wing party in the sense of the National Front in France. It had a single issue, which was our membership of the EU, and the whole debate of about the European Union, our membership of it, was whether we wanted to become as independent as America or Canada or other Western countries, or accept the supranationalism inherent in the European Union. Now, for various reasons, the United Kingdom's majority decision in Britain was that we should leave the European Union. That was not an example of isolationism or a desire to be unfriendly with continental European countries. And Theresa May has herself said as Prime Minister, what she wants in these negotiations at the end of it is to have a deep and substantive and amicable relationship between Britain and its European neighbours. We are part of Europe. We may not be part of the European Union, but our whole history has shown over 200 years that whenever democracy or stability is threatened in Europe by some potential aggressor, we have been one of those who has responded in order to protect freedom. We did it when Napoleon was trying to dominate Europe. Britain was with other European countries ensuring that did not happen. In 1914 when Belgium was invaded, 1939 when Poland was invaded by Hitler, we were not part of a European Union, we were not in continental Europe, but we went to war along with other countries because Europe's liberty was at threat. That hasn't changed because we're now leaving the European Union. So if there are future threats to Europe, its stability, its freedom, its democracy, its open government, we will be on the side of all those fighting to preserve that. And you don't, as our history has shown, although it might be nice to be part of the European Union, you don't have to be a member of the European Union for that to be ensured. And the challenge now is for ourselves, for France, for Germany, for Italy, for Spain, for the other countries, to recognize that Europe's diversity is unavoidable and that sometimes you have to think of new relationships in order to ensure that the aspirations of the various countries can all be realized.
Well, that's excellent. And I think just one final comment. I mean, this wonderful book, Power and Pragmatism, it's a very, very good book indeed. I was fascinated by your comment on pragmatic politicians and conviction politicians. Yes. And I suppose one conclusion might be that people like Romano Prodi, people like Junkers would be conviction politicians, where maybe Mrs. Merkel and Mr. Tusk were pragmatic politicians.
Well, the point I'm making is I don't say these are absolutes, that you're one or the other, and there the twain shall meet. What I say is that conviction politicians are people who have very deep beliefs, which they are absolutely certain are the right way forward, but occasionally they can be actually very pragmatic when it suits them. I worked for Margaret Thatcher. She could be very pragmatic when it was necessary. The reverse also applies. If you're pragmatic, you begin by saying, what is the common sense solution to this problem? But that doesn't mean you don't have convictions. You have ethical, moral convictions, you have deep values, but you don't want to say every problem has to be solved according to some ideological conviction that you start off with. That can lead you down a blind alley. So it's a difference of emphasis rather than a fundamental difference. And yes, I think you're right. I think Theresa May and Angela Merkel are on the side of the pragmatists. I think somebody like Mr. Juncker is perhaps more on the other end of that spectrum.
Sir Malcolm Rifkind, thank you very much indeed.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.